wanted to I wanted to focus in on some topics in the book. And then I was reviewing that today and seeing how, I think we'll get to it. The main topic I wanted to focus on. So this is part 2, and we're starting the chapter 10 on justice. And as I discussed last time or the time before, there is a dispute as to whether Jewish civil and procedural law, when I say procedural, I mean to say court procedure, whether that applies to Noahide law or not. So in other words, a lot of the corpus of Talmudic, particularly civil law, according to the second opinion, would apply to the nations as well. But under the first opinion, which is the baseline opinion, it doesn't, and the Noahide community has to construct its own procedures, and also has permission to, beyond simply enforcing the fact that, at the baseline, it just simply has to enforce that there's no theft, and it has to enforce all the other 6 laws, which is which means that one shouldn't, as far as civil law means, one shouldn't take from another. One shouldn't, to a certain extent, adultery falls within a civil law to a certain extent. One shouldn't commit adultery and so on. And then you have, so that's the basic. In other words, that the courts should be instituted in order to warn the people and judge them for any infractions of the other 6. The other opinion is that, first of all, the Noahide courts don't create their own procedure in terms of how many judges, what type of witnesses are good enough, how does the court run, what procedures does it have. No, that all goes according to Jewish law, Talmudic law. It's incorporated. And similarly, a lot of the civil law, meaning in terms of theft, but this also kind of incorporates, again, a lot of the same opinions of views and conclusions in regarding how do we understand the Noahide law of theft? Does it include all Jewish law that's similar to theft? So that would mean laws in terms of the the denying, withholding, and something, and an object that has been in someone's possession as collateral, or they've been guarding it as a guardian. I forget how you call that in English, and I'm a lawyer, but I forgot what that's called in English. If you're retaining someone else's item, and then claim you never received it, or actually, I could say you claim it was, for example, you claim it was that it was stolen from you, and then it's later found that that wasn't true. Anyway, all different forms of theft. In other words, all different forms of theft, of fraud, also of torts, will be included. Under the first view, particularly laws of torts, meaning to say, if the ox gores the other his neighbor's ox, those laws don't apply under Noahide law according to the baseline view. Only actual theft, meaning the taking of the property of another. But if your property causes harm to another, or other indirect causes of takings are not included under baseline Noahide law. Under the second view, the entire corpus of Jewish civil law is transferred onto Noahide law. So most of you already know this already, but I'm just reviewing it, particularly for you, Stephen. I guess I think everyone else has heard this many times already. But so now we go on to another topic, which has to do with justice as active or as abstract, on page 252, and that has to do with adjudication and enforcement. How far does the Noahide law go when we say that they have to appoint judges? Do they judge? Do they teach the law? Or are they enforcing it? Both. Does this law reflect the fact that the nations have to institute a government? What does this mean exactly? So let's take a look at this. We'll start from page 252. Justice as active and as abstract. I may need some help reading this. Let's see how it goes. See if my voice holds up. Justice, except perhaps in the most perfect and ideal utopian of societies, needs not only a court and judicial system to apply the law, but also employees of the state who enforce it, right? Okay, the police and perhaps even the armed forces in extreme circumstances, they are called for this purpose, and those who carry out punishment and detention have this role. They are all agents of the executive power of the state, variously symbolized in law as king or government. So in other words, in centuries gone by, in earlier times, the executive power was vested in a king and possibly even the judicial power. Now it's in the government and different executive, it's officially called an executive branch, right? Prime Minister, President, so on. So this power of the state has the quality of action, which drives, maintains, and where necessary restores social order in accordance with law. Justice needs the auxiliary of enforcement. So in other words, for justice to be effective, it has to have enforcement. Otherwise, it's not effective. So I think what he's implying here is that within the commandment to create, institute a system of justice, enforcement must be part and parcel of this commandment. It's just logical. It's a logical conclusion that we have to draw. Otherwise, it's not effective. To have an academic court that renders decisions which nobody needs to listen to is pointless. And specifically because we have an understanding that no-hide law has to be exercised and exist in situations where the society really needs to be reformed and strict justice needs to be meted out to knock the society into shape. In other words, there's an understanding that no-hide law may need to be instituted where it doesn't previously exist and people need to be taught. There's an understanding that that's the case. Now, remember what Maimonides says is that Moses was instructed by God to teach and enforce the no-hide laws among the nations. So clearly, it's also going to be a part. And if Moses would have brought the people into the land, and if the Messianic age would have happened immediately, I guess basically saying if Moses would have been the Messiah, I guess, or however that would have played out. But Moses would have enforced by force, to a certain extent, no-hide law on other nations. And it actually, I don't know if you guys remember, I know who was with me back years ago, where we studied some Tehillim, and we learned that King David, as he vanquished the Philistines, there are commentaries that say that he imposed no-hide law on the Gentile nations that he subdued. So yeah, there is that concept. It's kind of a little bit similar to colonization of the European powers in what they call third world countries and so on, where they may have, although it was forceful conquest, they may have raised certain standards or brought in at least certain Western practices into those countries and imposed them on those countries, right? It's very much the British, right? It's very much the British model. I know that much. Whether it's in India, different areas in Africa, where else would we say that that was the case? And I guess even in Palestine, I guess to a certain extent. Yeah, but I mean, most famously, I guess, in places like India and I guess other areas of Arabia. I don't know to what extent how successful they were there. Anyhow, back to this topic. So it's a similar idea that there is a place for that, and there may be a situation for that, and certainly there's an understanding that historically, with the flood and so on, and with the deterioration of many of the 70 nations in different various ways, there's going to be a need for enforcement. There's going to be a need where many within that society, maybe not the righteous and pious among the Gentiles, but there'll be a need for for force to enforce Noahide law and to knock people into shape through deterrent, through the threat of penal punishment, whether, and obviously that's also, we discussed in the past, one of the reasons why Noahide law permits, and in the simple terms, prescribes capital punishment for its crimes, for violation of the 7 laws. And we said then that in various circumstances, it may not have to be always meted out, but it's certainly within the license of the monarch, or within the judicial and executive branch, to mete out capital punishment for violation of any of the 7 laws. Anyway, I don't want to get back to that. That's a whole discussion about that. But that's the basic fact, is that each one of them is a capital offense. And that again brings out the fact that we want to, the Torah, God is seeking to, if necessary by force and through very powerful deterrent, make that these 7 laws, these 6, or even, I guess, including the 7th, are taboo, that they're absolute no-nos. That's really what happens when you say that that a moral crime is punishable by death. That's poison. You can't touch that. You can't go there. It's an absolute no, right? If you think about it, it closes a question. In other words, what I'm saying psychologically is a certain advantage of having a crime being a capital punishment. And we see it in our own societies right now. When a crime is not a capital punishment, there are those people who are going to say, I'm okay with going to prison. That's not a deterrent for me. I will commit this crime. I'll go to prison. That's okay. But nobody wants to die. I mean, although there maybe is a very small minority that are suicidal, but generally speaking, 99% of the population want to live. Okay. So, so having it as a capital crime, it sounds extremely harsh, but it's also a tremendous gift of kindness, because it creates a taboo in which, when it's enforced in a small amount, just maybe some examples will be needed, the rest of society begins to understand. And very quickly, you change the culture very, very quickly as it becomes adopted, and people understand and take it for granted that these things are just are taboos that cannot be done, period. And that's that. I guess maybe the last thing that's remained of that in our society is murder. People understand that's a violation of nature, that's something that a human being should absolutely not do. There isn't really much else that in modern society is an absolute taboo. So I think the idea of the Noahide law, in terms of what it seeks to accomplish, at least in a rational perspective, by meting out capital punishment, is create that taboo. We said last time also, I said I wasn't going to do this, but I guess I am, is that also that all the punishments, divine punishments, also reflect atonement. And if it's a capital punishment, that means that for the Noahide, each one of these are extremely severe, meaning to say that they spiritually bring a spiritual death to the person that can be undone by physical death. In other words, that because for the Noahide, all these laws are fundamental to the very purpose of their existence. And these laws are why they're here on earth, and to keep them are why they're here and why their soul is brought down into this world. And so violating any of them is an extremely serious break from their divine connection. And the way to correct that, again, if it's done intentionally and rebelliously, with intent and malice, is this punishment. Anyway, I mean, the truth is, what I said about intent and malice, is not the simple understanding, but is based on things we saw in this book, that if someone is not educated in a society that's familiar with these laws, then they're not guilty of a capital crime, and they need to be taught. That's what we learned. Actually, I think it's the only place I've seen it, is here in this book, where he brings out this point where the course is rational and sensible. All right, anyway, let's get back to the point we're making here, because I got off course. But the reason why I got off course is the point that I'm trying to bring out, is that the structure of the Noahide law it takes into account that we're dealing with a young society that that is wild. In other words, there's an assumption that Noahide law may have to deal with a society that's in chaos. And it's given the power of coercion and force in order to restore order. And that's implicit and intrinsic to Noahide law. And so it's given, so the courts, and within the seventh law of instituting courts, they're vested with a tremendous amount of power. Good, understand? Questions, comments? Make sense? It's a requirement. If you think about, it's funny, I was thinking about this just today and how lucky we are in a certain sense. I mean, think how we would be if we lived in a society that didn't keep many of the Noahide laws. Law and order. Some of it is just basic law and order. Some of it is social order that we've lost to a great extent in terms of familial relationships and those type of taboos. And that's an extreme danger we're facing right now in the West. But at least in terms of violent crimes and to a certain extent, financial crimes, there's a certain amount of strong deterrent. We have a very strong police system. And, so we have basically, although I think that it's really become a lot weaker than it used to be, to a certain extent of law and order. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about that. But the point is we have to thank God. And as it says in Ethics of the Fathers, without a government, a man could swallow his friend whole. Without government, there's chaos, there's terrible violence and bloodshed, because the worst of us overpower the better of us in that type of society. A barbaric society, the worst, the murderers, the thieves, the rapists, etc., they run rampant. And so the first thing that we need is a government, a monarch, an executive, and a judicial branch that gets that under control. And then we can start talking about also the other Noahide laws and start knocking society back into shape. And that's really where there's an understanding that Noahide law may have to face that very, very, very often. Okay, next paragraph. At the same time, and more primarily, justice is not only action, but also judgment. As such, it is distinct from the actual enforcement of the law. So in other words, so we have to try to create a system in which there's an enforcement body. So in other words, what we're saying is the first part of this law to institute courts of justice is we have to have a government. That means that Noahides, the nations of the world, have to get together and form some type of governing system. They have to come together and create a police force and a governmental force to keep law and order. That's the first thing. The second thing is they have to study the Noahide law, know it, educate upon it, and then they have to adjudicate on it. That means that they have to deal with litigants who come before them with questions of Noahide law, and also punish, in terms of penal law, those who are violators. So that's what we're going to say. So those are the two things. We just first discussed paragraph 1 about the enforcement aspect, which is just more the creation of an orderly system. And the second thing is the knowledge that you have to have a judicial body that's very, very familiar and educated in the Noahide law, and they can answer questions about it and judge the people, disputes, and penalize and issue rulings about Noahide law. Major historical issue has been if and when the judging function of justice must be separate from the enforcing function required for justice. So these two powers, the enforcement power, the police power, and the adjudicational power, are they together or separate? Right? So in modern times, this question was raised by the idea of an independent judiciary separate from the king. Nowadays, the executive branch of government, who previously also had a judicial function. Noahide law stipulates that judges should be appointed, but does not rule out the possibility that the executive, monarch, president, or prime minister might also participate in the judicial function. Okay, so under Noahide law, we don't have a requirement for separate branches of government as the democratic or republic system requires or envisions. You don't have to have that. You can have that. You don't have to. Now, in that case, I'm now on page 253. In that case, which is most likely to occur in the two extremes of social disorder in the person of a truly great leader like Solomon. So in other words, what he's saying now, when do we have a situation in which both powers are vested in the same person? So what we're saying is that's more usually in two situations which are really opposite and diametrically opposed. One is in a case of social disorder and breakdown. In that case, martial law, right? We don't have time to have a complex and long, drawn out judicial system. We have the same people that enforce, they judge, they adjudicate quickly, and they mete out punishment quickly to knock things, as I keep using that slang, in order to knock things into shape, meaning in order to restore order. The other case is just the opposite, in which you have a king that is so enlightened and his legitimacy is so strong, and the concern for corruption is so low that he can embody both branches. So just the opposite. So you have a very interesting situation. You have a combined governmental function which operates at both ends of the extreme, in the best of times and the worst of times. Okay. Now I'm just curious. So interestingly enough, so far he hasn't cited any sources, except for the fact that we're citing to the biblical story of King Solomon, that we know that he did both. The Talmud also says that King David also did both, that he also judged, that he would judge cases of, particularly it talks about how he took pleasure in deciding cases related to women and their menstruation and when they would be permitted under Jewish law to again cohabitate with their husbands, as we know that a menstruant is not permitted to her husband, has to purify herself. Those are familiar with those biblical passages. But that's only law for Jews. That's not a law for the children of Noah. In any event, the point is simply we have situations in which a king also judges, but those are in the best of times. So in that case, the requirement is that the executive leader practice proper judgment as distinct from exercising regular executive functions. So in other words, you can have a situation in which a king metes out justice without adjudication, right? In other words, if you have severe social disorder, there may be situations in which the king may have the military. I mean, it's not the way things are done, right, anymore, generally speaking, but they may have them if there's social breakdown and there's martial law and there's violent rioting, then the military may execute people on the streets. They may shoot down violent people in the streets, right? We generally don't have that, thank God, but if that might occur. I mean, actually, we do have it in cases of the police, right? Even today, if the police have to break into a home with their armed suspects, they often end up killing the suspects right there. So that's a form of the executive and police branch sort of quote adjudicating. They're not adjudicating, but they're meting out a punishment on the spot. I mean, you can say that it's in self-defense, and that might be an argument, but from another perspective, there simply is no time for any type of adjudication because of the law, because of their fear for the life, and they're simply carrying out an execution, right there. That's another possible way to look at it. Okay, but what he's saying here is that when we say that the king or the executive is carrying out a judicial function, that means the full judicial function, and meaning that the king is referencing to the law and following the rule of law in order to adjudicate matters of law and dispute. It is more practical, common, and generally desirable that the functions of executive government and judgment be vested in distinct persons and separate institutions. But this is not an invariably principle prescribed in Noahide law. There must be courts, but it is open as to whether or not executive leaders of the state may participate. So there's differences of opinion whether they have to be, the executive can participate or not. There's also another question. maybe we don't need a king. Maybe all we need is maybe their primary function is a judge, and the judge also has police force. In other words, that the judge reviews the facts and then issues a decree, or issues a certain judgment, and then orders the police or the army, but generally the police, to then execute his judgment. Who's to say that we have an executive branch at all? There seems to be, though, some assumption that we do, that for a government to run, generally there's some king, there's some, parliament, there's some council, and usually at least one monarch type figure, president, executive, prime minister, that is also been appointed. Okay, so far not that complicated, right? All familiar, modern, a lot of it pretty modern topics, nothing really out there. Okay, next paragraph. The question of the relationship between the enforcing and judging aspects of justice arises in a situation where society breaks down. All right, this is what I was talking about. The relationship between enforcement and judging comes comes to the fore when society breaks down, right? This breakdown can occur either because there is no state apparatus and effective control, or because the state is itself corrupt and does not enforce rigorous justice in its own personnel and other citizens. The question then is there a personal obligation on the individual who sees justice to act to restore and implement it? Or do we say that justice does not apply in a state of nature to which society reverts when society breaks down? And justice can only properly exist in when there is social order with functioning collective institutions of justice. This is a fascinating question. This is a kind of a philosophical question, right? So he's asking, this law that you have to institute courts, what does it really mean? Does it mean that, is that law imposed on the individual noahide, individual, non-Jew, that he has to, every individual of the nations themselves has to look to it to make sure that the laws are enforced, or it's only when there's a governmental body? So what do we say? Any thoughts, comments? And what do you think is the right thing that should be? Any thoughts on this? Basically, should a person take the law into his own hands? Is that something you think Noahide law gives a person the right to do? I could put it to you differently, and then I could put it this caveat. What about, maybe it depends? Does it depend, or it doesn't depend? Or is it never? What do you say? Come on, hands up, people. Put them up. Ross?
Well, the way we talk about it, I think is makes it what difficult is, like we need to establish a body of policemen and judges and so forth. We are the government, and that's the reason there is a judge. We are the government, and that's the reason there is a police force. Because what we're doing is governing ourselves. We're giving someone an office which can be occupied, whether that is a sheriff, police, judge. These are all offices, just like a king is an office. So what we're doing is we're saying, if in the event that there is a matter that arises, this is the procedure. We will go here to this judge or to this police officer or so forth. But as a society, that's what we're governing. We are the government. If we choose not to govern, as you pointed out, if we don't want to have a democratic or republic society of sorts, it's not necessary. But if we're going to establish law and order, then we have to have a way to maintain law and order, so that if a disruption occurs, we have to have a system in which we can restore law and order.
Now, but again, if you have a system breakdown, where the government isn't functioning for whatever reason. Maybe let's take a simple situation, okay? Let's say that there's a natural disaster, and a village becomes cut off, or this pandemonium breaks out. There's no police, and there's looting going on, right? I mean, it's happened. We know that it's happened. It's been in the news years ago. There's looting. That is a violation of Noahide law. Can a person take the law into his own hands? Now, obviously, a person would, you'd think at least they have the right to protect their own property. I think that's clear. But can
Depends
you
on,
draw-
it depends on what state you live in. It really does. In the state of Texas, you would have the right to defend someone else's livelihood.
Really? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Which is a part of the Noahide laws. I find it an interesting observation that the nations that have never fully developed in the last 150 years are nations that generally do not follow Noahide principles and laws. It's just evident. I mean, you can clearly see it. And there's degradations of it, obviously.
That's actually my question, whether that is the Noahide law, whether in a situation like that, an individual can make the decision to act as a police and protect someone else's property. You're saying your assumption is that that is the case.
Well,
Well, let's
would,
find out.
I would say I'd just submit this, that the Noahide in his sense for justice has an obligation to embody the idea of courts of justice as being a person of justice. Now, obviously, if I have the access to gather the information and turn it to authorities, I shouldn't do that because I don't really have the
Right.
power to do that. But we saw it during the big flood that happened in Houston some number of years ago. There were individuals that went in front of people's stores and guarded it for them when they knew they lived out of town and they weren't going to be able to make it back. And they were obviously not in trouble for doing that. And they many times had to rush people off with weapons. Now, nobody was killed, but
Right.
it's part of defending what is right in a society. And if we
Right.
don't, what's the alternative?
Right. Does make sense. That does make sense. So any other does everybody agree with Rod, or does anybody disagrees? And the truth is, the case I gave though is also limited because, okay, so the case we're talking about is in which case that the government breaks down. But what if, so that seems, everybody seems to agree in a case like that, that a person or a local community or neighbors can form their own government to police. Everyone seems to be in agreement. Is that right? Is anyone, all the A's shake your heads or something, so I know. Everyone agrees? Okay, so everyone's in agreement.
Stephen has his hand up.
I think he's in agreement, right? Is that what Stephen's doing?
Yes,
Okay,
basically, that's
okay.
where I'm at.
Okay.
Okay, so now let me ask you a different question. And I think I know the answer to this one too, but what if there is no societal breakdown? But it just happens that the government's slacking off or not available or something, or maybe, whatever the reason is. For example, give you an example that obviously happens, which is murder is committed. The government standards of proof are very high and the person goes off scot-free. Putting aside the fact that the government, as we know it, might then, punish a vigilante, but let's say that wasn't the case, hypothetically, let's say there'd be no punishment. Would it be permitted under Noahide law, if you could get away with it, to, execute this murderer? Obviously, you'd have to know that they're guilty. I mean, if you don't know you're guilty, you take a tremendous risk there, but.
I don't believe that we have that authority to do that. As an
What's the
individual.
difference between the two cases?
Well, the one case is that there is no way to find a way to apprehend and bring justice. We're not talking about
Right.
killing someone. We're talking about bringing a person to some sort of justice. And then the other is you have a society that is supposed to be functioning. And as a part of that society, hopefully, as a citizen of that society, you can help to affect, like, for example, we're seeing in some cities where here the example, of the thousands of crimes, and I forget what city it was. I just heard this, of the thousands of crimes that are being committed in that one area in like San Diego, it is committed by 350 people, not by the millions that live there. 350 people. They
San
keep getting
Francisco.
turned out. Yeah, San Francisco. And the whole point is I still don't think that we need to take the law in our own hands. The government is responsible. We have to hold them responsible. The establishment of justice means that we as Noahides should hold our established government accountable. Every nation should do that. Hold them accountable. That's our job. But our job's not to go hunt somebody down and kill them. That's just, I don't see that anywhere in Noahide code unless you can correct me.
Well, let me ask you this. In the Bible, it talks about the blood redeemer, right? Who takes revenge for a relative that was murdered. And there seems to be license for that. Is
No,
that
sir.
included in Noahide code or not?
No, I don't know. I maybe in the land. I don't know what the city of
Okay, so
refuge
it's a
in the
law,
Noahide
it's a
code.
law just for the land of Israel. That's how that's what it seems appears.
That's
Right,
I would say that, yes.
Okay, yeah, okay. I think yeah, I agree with you, Rob. I'll give anyone else have a comment on this before I say my piece?
Before you eviscerate me. No, I'm just
No,
joking.
no,
Go
no,
ahead.
no, not at all. I just want to explain this distinction we're making because I agree with you. And I also tell you why I think it's true. Sandy?
Just a quick question. Under Torah law, before anyone could be executed, you had to have at least 2 impeccable witnesses and go through
Right.
this whole process. Would that same standard apply to non-Jews who are trying to bring somebody to justice? Is it required the same standard there?
No.
And what about
It's
in the
like we're
land?
saying. I don't think so. That's a good
I don't know.
question. I
I
don't
just
know
don't
if it's any different. I don't know if it's going to be any different in the land or not in the land. That's actually, it has to do exactly with what we're talking about. The laws for Noahide law are a lot more flexible in order to permit the proper enforcement of law and order. The Jewish law is extremely strict. And let's face it, in many we call it a bit impractical, particularly in the cases, again, relating to social order. How many murderers are you have 2 impeccable witnesses? What do you, so unless there's 2 impeccable witnesses, you're not going to punish anyone. So the Noahide law is a lot more flexible because it's looking towards law and order. It's looking towards creating a very powerful deterrent. I want to also add that Jewish law as well vests in the king and the courts that if they see that murder and such are becoming out of control, and that doesn't even mean to the levels we have today. That was according to their standards, which was probably much less. They also had the power to suspend the need for witnesses. That wouldn't have been a biblically a Sanhedrin type ruling, but it would have been, again, a police action in order to, again, kind of return things to law and order and create a proper deterrent if things are getting out of control among a portion of the populace. So there's always the ability for that, but Noahide has that built in, that isn't a required, the high standards of procedure. That's what we started by saying. According to the baseline view, the procedure is flexible, but even according to the second view, there are 3 things that are procedurally for Jews. I'm trying to think of, I see if I can remember all 3. 2 of them, one of them is the number of judges. The second one is witnesses. And I'm trying to remember what the third one is. That are not required for a Noahide. Okay, the third one is a warning. The verbal warning that's required under Jewish law is not required under Noahide law, as you know. And again, Noahide laws are a lot more, again, there's supposed to be taboos in which everybody should know, and there's not as much as a need for a warning. But the truth is, the whole idea for a warning is really a surprise and a bit innovative. In other words, under Jewish law, that a person has to be warned before committing murder is kind of surprising. And even to be warned before committing idolatry is a bit, seems almost a little irrational, and, you know, it's a very high bar. So, you know, it's not something that we find required in other laws, and it can be argued that it makes the system, although on the one hand, it sounds like a very liberal, kind system, and that might be true, but it's also a system that may be hard to, again, as I said, create a deterrent when the bar of penalty is so high. So there's different sides to that. In other words, looking at it as from a judge or as an attorney's point of view and hearing that that's a requirement, you might say, this is not a judiciary can really function properly because it's just too hard to find someone guilty. And if that's the case, how are you you're not gonna have any deterrent. So there's two sides of this issue. And it seems that the oral law has told us that, as I said, that in fact, there are many that have the view that the penal law of the Sanhedrin that requires these warnings is a more ritualistic system of justice than a spiritual system of justice as opposed to a societal system of justice. In other words, there are those who have the view, because of these questions, that it seems like it's a system that may not function so well, that has to work in tandem with a king, and that its function may not be really societal as much it is as some type of spiritual atonement function. So it's, in other words, that there needs to be a separate judicial system controlled by the monarch whose purpose is to create a deterrent, while the Noahide system has the deterrent aspect already built in. So I've gone well beyond answering your question, Sandy. I've given a whole lecture based on your question.
Ross has his hand up.
I just wanted to make sure, Stephen Green, did you want to say something earlier?
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Okay, Ross?
Okay, thank you. I've looked at this for years, and this might be a good place to bring it up. We're all familiar with the situation of Esther and Mordecai in the land of Persia. And Mordecai is sitting at the gate, and he happens to hear two of the king's guards conspiring to commit murder of the king, to overthrow the king. We're familiar with this. The king, well, Mordecai goes and tells Esther. Then Esther whispers it to the king. And the king decides, well, I'm going to have this thoroughly investigated to find out whether this is true or not. We're never told that Mordecai is ever called as a witness, ever. True?
Right. True.
Okay. So that would imply that these two guards had been conspiring amongst other guards in order to have this plan executed. They had worked out a plan, and they were going to kill the king at some certain point. We don't know all the details, but evidently the king had his way of gathering the information, and he had to have talked to several guards. But he eventually did thoroughly investigate the matter, came to find out that this plot was true, and he had the guards executed.
Right.
Okay, so here we have, I don't know if there was a court particularly involved, but evidently there was sufficient evidence gathered by the FBI or the CIA or whoever he had to do this that it was convincing enough that he could go ahead and execute the people that were perpetrating the plot. I have to feel that there were more than just those two that were implicated in the beginning. There were more to it than the story or in the executions.
You know, you could use your imagination about it, and you could literally create a whole story. You know, you figure that King Ahasuerus, I mean, there probably was a lot of um, what do you call it? Royal and palace intrigue, and he probably had a lot of informants, I'm guessing. And he was probably worried. Can you hear? No, no.
You were breaking up on my end. I don't know.
Okay. So what I was saying, I mean, my imagination starts to go a little wild in terms of what you're discussing. When I have to understand that since Ahasuerus investigated the matter and found it out, you know, that he probably, considering that he was a bit paranoid to begin with, he probably had palace informants, he probably had spies, and he probably had someone turncoat on them and catch them in the act, catch them saying something, or you know, doing something related to the rebellion. Most likely, I don't know the details, but you're right. It doesn't, for some reason, the Megillah, the story of Esther, the book of Esther, doesn't find it important to let us know how that came about. And I guess it wasn't important so much to our story, but no, it does seem like that Mordechai was behind the scenes and was not directly involved in that at all. He wasn't a high-ranking minister, and he may not have came. He certainly didn't come inside, you know, inside the king's chambers and courtyards or whatever it may be. He was on the outside. It seems he was hanging around the outside.
Well, the bottom line is they weren't executed just on hearsay.
Right, they did find something, correct, but evidently, but not, there's no clear evidence that it was witnesses. I want to add, though, that you brought this as a very interesting example because it says somewhere in our book here that exactly what you're talking about. This refers to rebellion against the monarch or the executive, and that has a different rule, and that's punishable. That's a capital offense, and that capital offense is meted out by the monarch himself. So that really would be the explanation here, is that they were seeking to rebel against the king they wanted to assassinate the king, I believe, and so he acted against them as them being rebels against the crown and executed them. So that's very exclusively, you know, within the king's power to do that in order to properly hold and strengthen his office. So that's a separate, it's part of this rule, but independent of judiciary. It's a power vested in the king or the executive, for that matter. Treason is something that, you know, has a penalty of death potentially. Okay. So let's see what he has to say. So what I wanted to say again about what Rod was saying is it depends on the circumstances. So when you have a situation in which you have complete chaos, so you don't have a government, then you have to have individuals to step up and create some law and order and protect the vulnerable. However, when you have an established and a government that's been on the consent of the people, and they have certain procedures that have been, so there's an understanding that those have been accepted because they've been implemented by the people's representatives, whether that's the monarch or however else, it's still considered by the nation's representatives. Then when someone X tries to carry out on their own, when they're not satisfied with the outcome of the government that has been created by the people, then that's really, even though it appears to be carrying out justice, it's really undermining justice because it's weakening the system. And so overall, it's a sabotage of the commandment to create a system of justice. So that you can't do. So at least that would be the simple, that's what we would think. Let's see what he has to say here. Although the truth is we've run out of time and we haven't really finished the topic. We haven't finished the topic, but I think this is the basic answer. So in cases where the government begins to break down or has broken down, then people would be permitted to take the law into their own hands. However, if you have a legitimate Ben Noach system, then you should not take the law into your own hands. However, what if you have something like we have today? And this is a sticky thing to say publicly, but I'm not telling, and so therefore I'll say it with the caveat that I'm not implying anyone should take the law into their own hands, but academically speaking, okay? In a society like, for example, that doesn't enforce or doesn't penalize or judge all of the 7 Noahide laws, there's certain laws that it's ignoring, not carrying out. What about that? So it's like a half and half system. So is that a corrupted system in which you'd be able to take things into your own hands? Well, first of all, I think the long and short of it is that from a practical standpoint, in terms of what God wants, the answer is no. Meaning God doesn't want people to, act, for example, mete out capital punishment for a violation of Noahide law. What God wants is that we should try to persuade, and then, well, as I've heard some commentators say, politics, what is it? Is downstream of culture. I think that's the expression. Politics is downstream of culture, meaning to say we have to change the culture and the societal norms and get people to, as I said, have the proper taboos. And then once you have that, then you can, then you can try to make changes in terms of the governmental system that it should better fit and should better conform to Noahide values and expectations. Again, historically, there have been exceptions. That hasn't historically been the way things were done in the past, but we live in a very different society than the way societies ran, in ancient times. So things that were acceptable then and that even populations would have deemed legitimate are not today. In other words, maybe the acceptance very often of a colonizing ruler may have been accepted in many ancient cultures as a sign, for example, that, well, their God is stronger than our God, so we should accept this. Things like that. There may have been more, I didn't live at that time, but there may have been more of an acceptance. Well, in today's society, we have a very, very educated, I should say electorate, population, and we need to convince people as opposed to coerce people just simply through force of arms. So that's basically our answer. We have a situation as maybe today where there's certain things that don't fall within Noahide law. We have a much harder job than in the past. It's of taking up arms and getting an army together like maybe Alexander the Great did, where he imposed Hellenism on most of the ancient world. It's not the way things are done anymore, and we have to persuade people. We have the internet, and people need to be convinced by persuasion. I think that's very much what the Mashiach is going to do, is the people who can be persuaded, he will persuade. And those, I guess, who raise arms against him, that one might be a different situation. But I guess hopefully when he comes, we'll find out how that goes. The hope is that he'll be able to, his divine power of persuasion will be so powerful that there won't be any need for any further wars at that point. But I guess hopefully, God willing, soon we'll find out. Okay, everyone, I guess last questions or comments before we wrap up. Okay, so we were about to get to the topic about the story of the Jacob's sons and Shechem and how that relates to the issue we're talking about. And but I can say that we do see that there's a civil activism that Noahide law requires, that wants to see the Bnei Noah get involved in their societies and try to, I guess both first culturally, as I said, by teaching and educating, and then politically to try to make Noahide values normative in their societies. All right. Okay, everybody. Nice talking to you all. Nice sharing with you all. And You're welcome.
Thank
Very
you,
much. Be
Rabbi.
well.
We'll chat with you
You-
later.
Rabbi.
All right, bye.